Hello students, welcome to another session on residential space designing. The topic that we'd cover today is housing problems and shortage in India and the housing policies and programs that have been devised to rectify the problem. Housing, as is commonly understood, is not just something which provides the inmates shelter and protection, but one which fosters their growth and development, satisfies their economic, social and psychological needs. It molds the life and eventually the lifestyle of the family members. The families, especially the breadwinner's occupation and income status, rootedness to the place and many other factors influence owning or renting of a house by the family. Government's efforts also ensure housing for those who can't afford one of their own. Despite all efforts, the country is facing problems and shortages related to housing in a large measure. Do you have any idea on the housing scenario in India? The statistics you see on the screen is itself self-explanatory. It is clear that the 2011 census of India declared that the urban population of the country stood at 377 million or 31% of the total population. This rate of urbanization has resulted in many issues such as land shortage, shortfall in housing and tremendous pressure on available infrastructure, transportation deficits and stress on lack of basic amenities like water, sanitation and healthcare for the residents. The estimated number of total households, which was 19.2 crore, in which both rural and urban encompass, which was in 2001 had risen to 24.7 crore in 2011 census, a rough increase by 5.5 crore. India can be proud that a majority of the households, irrespectively of the locale, urban or rural, live in own houses, that is more than 90% in rural and 70% in urban areas. This trend has been reported to be on the increase compared to the previous census report. The situation seems to be satisfactory, yet there is something amiss. For that, an understanding of the difference between two concepts, namely housing need and housing demand, is necessary. How do they differ? Housing need is the extent to which the quality of existing accommodation falls short of that required to provide each household or person in the population, irrespective of one's ability to pay or particular preferences with accommodation of a specific minimum standard or above. Contrarily, demand is an economic concept. The standard and amount of housing a household can command is the result of income and ability to pay. It does not employ achievement of any specified minimum standard. It is predicted that the population in urban areas would show sustained increase, thereby enhancing and highlighting the number of urban poor and their temporary informal housing arrangements. Such facts all the more pinpoint for a special address of the housing situation in India and for strategically streamlining the policies and programs for the national cause. In today's session, let us have a look at the reasons, causes for housing problems and shortage in India and the policies drafted to tackle the issues. First, let us understand what these terms are. Housing shortage. This aspect relates to the lack of balance between the need for housing and its distribution. The major causes which can be pointed out exclusively for housing shortage in India are rate of housing not keeping pace with demand, demand-supply imbalance, and the gap between total demand and the total stock of houses. Recent statistic claims that housing shortage has decreased in the recent years compared to earlier data. The table seen on the screen is an NBO report which proclaims that the state-wise distribution of housing shortage at the All India level has decreased from 24.71 million in 2007 to 18.78 million in 2012. Definitely, it could have been achieved only by the earnest efforts of the government machinery. Nevertheless, the invisible drastic shortages estimated in both the urban and rural settlements have to be mitigated on a war footing. Housing shortage has to be given a thought on other lines too. Let us see what the technical group on urban housing shortage formulated for the 12th five-year plan, that is between 2012 to 17, has to say. They had defined housing shortage based on an analysis of 4 important components like excess of households over the acceptable housing stock, that is people living in informal properties, number of extra houses needed due to congestion, number of extra houses needed due to obsolescence, and number of kacha houses that must be upgraded. So this aspect proposes the issue in 2 colors, namely qualitative and quantitative attributes. Many factors like changes in family and household structure, increase in population, demand-supply discrepancies, shift in urban-rural ratio, kacha houses, and increase in slum dwellers, to name a few, contribute greatly to housing shortage in quantitative terms. Housing shortage addressed in qualitative terms projects a gap between total demand and total stock of houses. More than 40% of all households have 1 room or less in their houses. Less than 13% have more than 3 rooms. See the disparity in occupancy status. Next is housing problem in India. Housing problem in India is usually viewed to include 2 facets, namely shortage and substandard housing. Reasons for housing problems in India can be attributed to many reasons as shown on the screen, like burgeoning population, rapid urbanization, and eventual migration of population from rural to urban settlements lacking in proper housing facilities. Other reasons that can be added to these are increasing cost of construction, absence of organized building sector, slow and hesitant adoption of modern technologies, lack of needed awareness, non-adoption of need-based scientific developments in the field, especially in terms of materials and techniques used, and low priority offered by government in planning allocation of funds. The net result is the emergence of substandard housing. What does substandard house mean? You will understand if you go through the points that appear on the screen. Such houses pose a very pathetic image as unacceptable type of houses, unplanned structures, unhealthy housing like row houses, shared accommodation, etc., aged houses which are dilapidated, outmoded, damaged, obsolete and unhygienic, shared housing, different ownership patterns, congestion and overcrowding, availability of less space per person, that is below standard recommendations, growth of slums, polluted environments, eyesore to onlookers, and value depreciation to adjoining buildings or sites. Average household size in 2011 census was 4.9. It was pathetic to hear that the mean dwelling area occupied was well below 1 cent of land both in urban and rural areas. Similarly, when urban houses gratified the minimum 120 square foot per person standard, rural houses failed in the factor. Hence, we have a long way to go. Aerial views of all Indian cities stand testimony to the pathetic conditions. Albeit, these facts prove that the status is not bleak as it was once in India. Those that need special address to improve the status are proactive measures such as control on poor quality housing, satisfaction of essential services like electricity, water and sanitation, check on use of substandard materials, building structurally and hygienically safe housing, respect for the specific problems which highlight urban-rural divide like overcrowding and development of slums for the former and inadequate amenities for the latter, repair or rebuilding of dilapidated, obsolete, unsafe houses. Such impending problems and the lethargic efforts from the administrative mechanisms which at some point of the time had come to a grinding halt had forced upon the Indian government to chalk out a comprehensive nationwide applicable policy emphasizing distinct priorities for the sustained development in the housing sector. Let us have a look at those. First one is the national housing policies. Consideration for drafting a national policy for housing saw the limelight only in 1988 with the commencement of the national housing policy. Till then, an idea for formulating a comprehensive policy encircling the whole nation never took shape. Henceforth, including the first one, the ministry had announced and implemented 8 different policies with multiple priorities for each one. The 4 policies of the government, namely, which are very, very noteworthy, are presented in the screen. They are the National Housing Policy and Habitat Policy 1988, National Housing Policy 1994, National Urban Housing and Habitat Policy 2007, and the Draft National Rental Housing Policy. We shall learn more about the policies, objectives, and action programs in detail. The first of its kind, a proactive one, was the National Housing Policy and Habitat Policy. Government of India had formulated many housing policies, especially since the late 80s. This policy, NHPHP, was drafted in 1988. The policy in its preamble focused on housing as not just a commodity but also as a productive investment. Housing here was portrayed as machinery that could gear up economic endeavors and go hand in hand in the attainment of the national policy goals with clear-cut objectives. And what are they? By facilitating access to land, materials, technology and finance, offering seamless support to encourage participation by the needy to gift themselves a proper dwelling, through provision of drinking water, sanitation and other basic services, attempt improvement of the environment of human settlements, thereby raise people's quality of life, envisage and promote access to shelter for the homeless and disadvantaged, that is the reserved category, labor class and low income vulnerable groups. This class reported to hold premium priority in the policy. Fourth one is recognize the qualitative difference of rural housing from that of urban housing, and drafting a variety of strategies to achieve the stated objectives. Those upheld as most important were promoting accessibility to available land at nominal rates to foster housing, assuring security of tenure to tenants in rural and urban dwellings, expanding scope for institutional financing or housing efforts, an impetus to housing in rural settings, knowing well the inherent complexities. In accordance with these factors, the policy had put forth its action plans. And what are they? To enable and facilitate easy implementation of its decisions, the policy had laid concrete action plans rooted on the 2 broad strategies, primarily catering to the housing needs, including site allocation for reserved category, labor class, wage earners and vulnerable sections of the society, and secondly, facilitating financial assistance to promote housing by disbursing loans or subsidy to select beneficiaries. Understood the essence of this policy? The next one is the National Housing Policy, 1994. 4 years after NHPHP, the National Housing Policy was formulated in 1992, which was approved by the Parliament in August 1994. The policy included 8 classic features. To be precise, the policy's aims were to provide the necessary backup to support the construction of new and additional building units, upgrade the existing building units, ensure land availability and confer homestead rights, minimize displacement of rural households by developmental projects, undertake sufficient rehabilitation measures, especially for victims of natural calamities, promote use of indigenous materials and construction techniques, facilitate basic infrastructure services including water, sanitation and roads, offer protective discrimination especially to the weaker sections of the society. The objectives framed therefore were thus wholesome, covering all aspects of housing. The third one is the National Urban Housing and Habitat Policy 2007. The first policy specific to urban housing was the NUHHP, National Urban Housing and Habitat Policy in 2007, which was formulated by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, and it is called as MOHUPA, which was established in 2007. The key objectives of the policy focused on affordable housing for sustainable urban development. In accordance with the policy framework, many programs specific to affordable housing have since been incorporated. The major ones being Rajiv Awas Yojana or RAY, Affordable Housing in Partnership, it's called AHP, and Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, JANURAM, Model State Affordable Housing Policy, Draft National Urban Rental Housing Policy. First one is RAY or Rajiv Awas Yojana. Now it's called MOHUPA 2012A. Rajiv Awas Yojana is a program aimed at providing affordable housing to the urban poor. On May 2015, Rajiv Awas Yojana rolled over and was merged into the Housing for All HFA by 2022 policy. This policy framework has analyzed the RAY and HFA 2022 policies after developing a document for sustainable policies for addressing the problem of affordable housing. Second one is Affordable Housing in Partnership, MOHUPA 2013. Affordable Housing in Partnership is a market solution based approach promoted to enhance housing by involving private players. It has multiple linkages to other aspects of the individual's well-being. Affordable housing can augment benefits to the society's education and health, access to health care, perceived control and life satisfaction, employment prospects and income, and of course reduce crime. Affordable housing refers to any housing that meets some form of affordability criterion, which could be income level of the family, size of the dwelling unit, or affordability in terms of EMI size or ratio of house price to annual income. MOHUPA in its 2011 report had taken note of both income and size of affordable space by income-based grouping criteria to define the concept. You will be able to see that in the table presented in the screen, which was given by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation criteria for affordable housing. The policy framework for affordable housing is provided by the National Urban Housing and Habitat Policy along with the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, Basic Services for the Urban Poor BSUP, Integrated Housing and Slum Development Program IHSDP, and the Rajiv Awas Yojana. So the third one is Januram 2015A. This program aimed at constructing 1.5 million houses for the urban poor during the mission period 2005 to 12 in the 65 selected mission cities. Two policies under this program, namely Januram Targeted Housing, is of prior importance. They are Integrated Housing and Slum Redevelopment Program and Basic Services for the Urban Poor. This Integrated Housing and Slum Redevelopment Program is a direct housing policy measure under Januram. The IHSDP covers those cities, towns that are not covered by BSUP and conceives of an 80:20 sharing ratio between the national and state governments, urban local bodies, etc. Basic Services for the Urban Poor BSUP, managed by the Ministry of Urban Development, on the other hand, aims at providing entitlements like security of tenure, affordable housing, and commitment for services such as water, sanitation, health and education, and social security to low-income segments in 65 mission cities. And the fourth one is the Draft National Rental Housing Policy. This policy aims at promoting rental housing as an option for those who couldn't afford own houses, like those belonging to the target groups of population, mainly destitute, houseless and disabled people, socially and economically weaker sections, specific target groups including migrant laborers, working women and students, aspiring home buyers seeking stopgap arrangement, and the working class. These groups are presented with a basket of options through the government's social rental housing, affordable rental housing and institutional rental housing packages. The policy is so framed to enable formalization of rental housing through regulatory and legal frameworks, enhancement of fund flow along with incentives for rental housing, promotion of institutions, organizations for constructing, managing, maintenance and operations of rental house stock, that is resident management corporations, residential REITs, that is real estate investment trusts, employment or employee housing, etc. Now let us have an idea of the current prominent housing policies in India. Among all policy initiatives of the government, two flagship policies received significant mention. They are Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, a Housing for All 2022, and the Smart Cities Mission. These two policies have caused visible ripples in the housing sector and have successfully affected the demand and supply of residential real estate endeavors, leaving telltale marks on the issues of informal housing and housing for the urban poor. A Real Estate Regulatory Act also has been introduced. This act does not essentially focus on providing incentives to promote informal housing. Rather, tries to increase the transparency in the formal residential markets. The first one is Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, a Housing for All 2022. The government has recently introduced HFA 2022 policy. The erstwhile policies envisaged over the years had included some modified versions of HFA 2022 policy. This new policy envisaged providing every Indian family with a Pakka house with all infrastructural facilities like water, toilets and water supply round the clock. These have been envisaged based on 4 attributes to housing shortage, which Mahupa report on HFA identifies as component parts made up by 4 classes of dwellers. They are slum dwellers, urban poor living in non-slum areas, prospective migrant population, destitute and housing homeless people. The mission aims to provide housing for all by 2022 by envisioning a multitude of strategies. To name a few, enabling tax rebates, monetary support, less stringent development regulations, competitive interest rates have been put forth. It primarily adheres to funding and providing incentives to developers and buyers. Second one is the Smart Cities mission. At the second flagship housing policy, this policy focuses on leveraging land availability, implementation under single entity SPVs, that is special purpose vehicles, and buttressing fundamental facilities for infrastructure. A few Indian cities have devised strategies to convert the smart city initiatives with the Housing for All schemes to tackle issues of the formal housing sector. Some of these initiatives would include housing for economically weaker sections or affordable housing, slum redevelopment, rental housing, working women's hostels, shelters for the homeless, etc. as part of the Smart City plan. Further development is channelized through public-private partnership or PPP model with the involvement of private developers. Now have an idea on the various housing programs introduced and implemented in India. There are almost 19 programs implemented in India in the past 5 decades. You will be able to see them listed on the screen. For the government, housing the citizens has been a sustained crusade because the efforts are still in progress, mainly because it considers adequate shelter to mean more than roof over one's head. It also essentially encompasses factors like adequate privacy, adequate space, physical accessibility, adequate security, adequate lighting, heating and ventilation, and adequate basic infrastructure, and slating all to be available at affordable cost. Apart from the housing policies and the programs discussed, each of the 12 5-year plans also had allocated specific funds to housing needs of the country. Especially since 7th 5-year plan in 1975 onwards, urban housing shortage and slum development have been receiving exclusive focus. These are ample proof highlighting the ardent endeavours of the government to house people from all strata in India. This session was meant to introduce you to the status of housing in India, causes and reasons for housing shortage, governmental intervention, and the need for beneficiaries' active participation to realize mutual benefits by all the stakeholders. To summarize, awareness generation to sensitize the population on the housing issues at hand and to educate them to access the available programs and schemes, thereby strengthen the nation's housing sector, is what is needed now. People should be made to understand that the objective of the government is not simply motivating people to have a roof over their heads, but to have a Pakka shelter catering to all their needs. In conclusion, I would like to add that the educational institutions in particular can shoulder a major role through their outreach programs like NSS and can reach the unreached through their programs, and they can disseminate the objectives. I hope you will join the crusade in the national vision and mission for a developed India.